Hello, my sleepy friends. If you could quietly walk through the streets of a modern city, whether it is London, New York, Karachi, or Rome itself, you might believe that the rules shaping daily life belong entirely to the modern world. Traffic moves in organized lanes. Governments write laws that regulate behavior. Buildings follow carefully designed systems of engineering and safety. People stand in lines, respect certain legal boundaries, and accept countless everyday rules without ever questioning where they came from. Yet hidden beneath many of these ordinary habits lies something surprisingly ancient. A large number of rules that modern societies still follow today were first created nearly 2,000 years ago by the Romans. Ancient Rome was not simply a powerful empire known for its armies and monumental architecture. It was also one of the most organized legal societies the world had ever seen. Roman lawmakers believed that a strong civilization depended on clear rules that everyone understood. They developed complex legal systems that governed everything from property ownership and contracts to public behavior and urban planning. Over time, these laws spread across the enormous territories controlled by Rome, shaping how people lived from Britain to North Africa and from Spain to the Middle East. Many centuries have passed since the fall of the Roman Empire, yet surprisingly large portions of modern law still reflect Roman thinking. Some rules that guide daily behavior today were originally created for problems that existed in ancient Roman cities. Even though the world has changed dramatically since then, these rules continued surviving through medieval law codes, European legal traditions, and eventually modern governments. One of the most familiar examples involves the idea that a person is considered innocent until proven guilty. This principle is so deeply embedded in modern legal systems that many people assume it must be a relatively recent idea connected to modern human rights. In reality, the roots of this concept can be traced back to Roman legal philosophy. Roman jurists believed that the burden of proof should fall on the person making an accusation rather than on the person defending themselves. In Latin legal writing, this idea was expressed in the phrase "e incumbit probatio qui dicit, non qui negat," meaning that the responsibility of proof lies with the one who asserts, not the one who denies. Another Roman rule that still shapes modern life involves contracts. In Roman society, agreements between individuals were treated with enormous seriousness. If two people made a deal involving property, services, or financial exchange, Roman law expected both sides to honor the agreement. Over time, the Romans developed detailed legal frameworks explaining how contracts worked, what conditions made them valid, and how disputes could be resolved. Today, modern contract law still follows many of the same principles that Roman lawyers first developed thousands of years ago. The influence of Roman rules can also be seen in the structure of cities themselves. Ancient Roman urban planners believed that cities should be organized in ways that supported order, safety, and efficiency. They introduced building codes, street planning systems, and public infrastructure regulations that controlled how structures were built and how public space was used. Roman engineers carefully designed roads, drainage systems, and aqueducts that allowed large populations to live together in relatively stable urban environments. Many of these ideas later influenced European cities during the Middle Ages and Renaissance, eventually shaping the urban planning standards that modern governments still follow today. When cities create zoning laws, building safety codes, and public infrastructure regulations, they are often unknowingly continuing traditions that began in Roman administrative systems. Even everyday social behavior sometimes reflects ancient Roman habits. For example, the concept of standing in an organized line while waiting for services or public access reflects Roman approaches to managing large crowds in urban environments. Roman officials frequently organized public spaces such as markets, baths, and distribution centers so that citizens could access resources in an orderly fashion rather than through chaotic competition. Another surprising Roman influence involves roads themselves. The famous Roman road networks were built with remarkable precision and durability, connecting distant parts of the empire with carefully engineered routes. Many of these ancient roads eventually became the foundations for later transportation systems across Europe. In some places, modern highways still follow routes originally planned by Roman engineers nearly 2,000 years ago. Roman ideas about citizenship also left a powerful legacy. In ancient Rome, citizenship carried specific rights and responsibilities that distinguished citizens from outsiders. This concept gradually evolved through centuries of political development and eventually influenced the formation of modern democratic societies. The idea that individuals possess legal rights within a state and that governments must recognize those rights reflects intellectual traditions that can be traced back to Roman legal thinking. The Romans also believed strongly in written law. Instead of relying only on tradition or the personal authority of rulers, Roman society increasingly depended on clearly recorded legal codes that citizens could understand. One of the earliest examples was the 12 Tables, a set of laws created in the early Roman Republic to ensure that legal rules were visible and consistent for everyone. This commitment to written law later influenced medieval European kingdoms and eventually modern legal systems across the world. Today, constitutions, civil codes, and legal statutes all reflect the same basic idea that laws should be written, public, and accessible to the people they govern. What makes these Roman rules especially fascinating is that many of them survive today, even though the original context that created them has long disappeared. The Roman Empire collapsed more than 15 centuries ago, yet the legal structures and social habits it introduced continued spreading through history, shaping societies that no longer even remembered where these ideas began. As we continue exploring deeper into the world of ancient Rome, we will discover even more surprising examples of rules, habits, and legal principles that still quietly influence modern life. Some were designed to control crowded cities, others to manage property and trade, and some simply to maintain order within a vast empire that stretched across 3 continents. And yet, long after the emperors disappeared and the legions marched into history, many of these Roman rules never truly vanished. They quietly survived, hidden inside the everyday systems that still guide how the modern world functions today. As Roman civilization expanded across vast territories during the height of the empire, its leaders became increasingly aware that controlling millions of people required more than military strength. Roads, armies, and taxes could hold an empire together for a time, but long-term stability depended on something deeper, a shared system of rules that ordinary people would follow every day without constant force. Roman lawmakers understood that if society could be organized through predictable laws, daily life would function smoothly even in cities filled with strangers. Over centuries, they built one of the most influential legal frameworks the world had ever seen, and many of the rules created for Roman society quietly survived long after the empire itself disappeared. One surprisingly familiar Roman idea that still shapes modern life is the concept of legal adulthood. In Roman society, people were not automatically treated as fully independent members of the legal system from birth. Instead, Roman law created specific stages of legal responsibility. Children were protected under the authority of their fathers, but once they reached a certain age, they gradually gained the right to make contracts, own property, and participate in public life. This concept eventually evolved into the modern idea that people become legally responsible adults at a specific age determined by law. Today, nearly every country establishes a legal age for voting, signing contracts, or making independent decisions, reflecting the same basic principle that Roman lawmakers introduced 2,000 years ago. Roman law also shaped how societies deal with property ownership. In the ancient world, disputes over land and possessions were common sources of conflict. The Romans developed extremely detailed rules explaining who owned property, how ownership could be transferred, and what rights individuals possessed over their land or goods. Roman jurists carefully defined the difference between possession and ownership, creating legal categories that allowed disputes to be resolved without violence. Modern property law across many countries still follows these same concepts. When courts today examine who owns land, who has legal access to it, and how ownership can change through contracts or inheritance, they are often relying on principles first developed in Roman legal thinking. Another Roman rule that continues shaping modern life involves the idea of public infrastructure, maintained for the benefit of society. Roman cities were filled with structures designed not only for individual use, but for the entire population. Aqueducts carried water from distant mountains into crowded urban centers. Public baths allowed citizens to maintain hygiene, and roads connected towns across enormous distances. Because these systems served everyone, Roman authorities created rules governing how they could be used and maintained. Damaging public infrastructure was considered a serious offense because it threatened the stability of the entire community. Today, modern governments maintain similar rules protecting public resources such as highways, bridges, water systems, and transportation networks, continuing the Roman idea that certain structures belong to society as a whole rather than to individual owners. Even the concept of public responsibility has roots in Roman tradition. Roman citizens believed that maintaining order required cooperation between individuals and the state. Laws regulated how people behaved in markets, how they conducted business, and how they interacted within crowded urban spaces. These regulations were designed to prevent chaos in cities where hundreds of thousands of people lived side by side. Modern societies still follow similar principles when they regulate trade, enforce safety standards, or require businesses to follow certain rules designed to protect consumers. Roman legal culture also emphasized written documentation. In a large empire where people often conducted business with strangers, written records became essential for preventing misunderstandings. Contracts, property transfers, and official decisions were carefully recorded so that disputes could later be resolved using documented evidence. This practice created a culture of record-keeping that deeply influenced later legal systems. Today, modern governments maintain extensive documentation systems for property ownership, legal agreements, and financial transactions, reflecting the same principle that written records help maintain trust within complex societies. Another rule inherited from Roman tradition involves the structure of courts and legal hearings. Roman courts often relied on organized procedures that allowed both sides of a dispute to present arguments before a decision was made. Judges examined evidence, listened to testimony, and attempted to apply established legal principles rather than arbitrary personal opinions. This early attempt to create structured legal processes influenced later European court systems and eventually the modern concept of fair trials. Roman lawmakers also understood that cities required clear boundaries between public and private spaces. Streets, markets, temples, and government buildings belonged to the public, while houses and private land remained under individual control. This distinction allowed cities to function efficiently while protecting personal property rights. Modern urban planning still follows the same idea, when governments manage public roads, parks, and institutions, while individuals maintain ownership of private homes and businesses. Perhaps one of the most subtle Roman legacies appears in how societies treat legal precedent. Roman jurists frequently examined earlier decisions when resolving new disputes. By looking at how similar situations had been handled in the past, they could maintain consistency in the application of law. This practice gradually evolved into the broader legal tradition of precedent, where earlier rulings help guide future decisions. Modern legal systems around the world still rely on this idea, demonstrating how Roman thinking continues influencing justice even in the 21st century. As the centuries passed after the fall of Rome, these rules did not simply disappear. Medieval scholars studied Roman legal texts preserved in monasteries and libraries, rediscovering principles that could help organize societies emerging from the chaos of the early Middle Ages. Universities began teaching Roman law as a model for legal reasoning, and governments across Europe gradually incorporated many of these ancient ideas into their own systems. In this way, the Roman world quietly continued shaping history long after its armies and emperors vanished. Laws written for an ancient empire survived through centuries of political change, slowly blending into the foundations of modern civilization. Today, many people follow these rules every day without realizing that their origins lie deep within the legal traditions of ancient Rome, where lawmakers first attempted to build a society guided not by chaos or personal power, but by written systems that everyone could understand and follow. As Roman law continued spreading across the vast territories of the empire, its influence reached far beyond courtrooms and government buildings. The Romans believed that order in society depended not only on legal systems, but also on everyday habits that guided how people behaved in public spaces. These habits gradually became unwritten rules that shaped daily life, and many of them remain surprisingly familiar today. Modern societies often assume that these behaviors developed naturally over time, yet in many cases they were first encouraged, organized, or even enforced by Roman authorities trying to manage the enormous cities under their control. One important example can be seen in the idea that streets and public pathways must remain clear for movement. Ancient Roman cities were often extremely crowded places filled with merchants, carts, animals, and pedestrians, all competing for space. Without rules controlling how streets were used, chaos could quickly disrupt trade and transportation. Roman officials therefore created regulations that restricted where certain activities could occur. Merchants could not block major roads with stalls. Building materials could not remain scattered in public pathways, and vehicles were often restricted during certain hours to prevent congestion. These early attempts at traffic regulation helped keep cities functioning efficiently. Modern traffic laws, street regulations, and pedestrian zones continue following the same basic principle that public roads must remain organized and accessible. Another Roman rule that still shapes daily life involves the way societies organize markets and commercial trade. In ancient Rome, markets were carefully supervised by government officials who ensured that goods were sold fairly and that merchants followed consistent standards. Weights and measures were standardized so that customers could trust the quantities they received. Selling spoiled or dishonest goods could lead to serious penalties because authorities believed that fair trade was essential for maintaining social stability. Today, governments still regulate commerce through consumer protection laws, food safety regulations, and standardized measurement systems, reflecting the Roman idea that markets require oversight to remain trustworthy. The Roman Empire also introduced important ideas about public sanitation that continue influencing modern cities. Large urban populations created serious challenges involving waste disposal and cleanliness. To address these problems, Roman engineers constructed drainage systems and public latrines that allowed waste to be managed in a controlled way. Laws were established to prevent people from dumping garbage into streets or waterways that served the entire community. These early sanitation regulations represented one of the first attempts to manage urban hygiene through organized infrastructure and legal enforcement. Modern cities still follow similar principles when regulating sewage systems, waste management, and environmental cleanliness. Another surprisingly familiar Roman rule involves noise and public disturbance. Roman cities were lively places filled with merchants calling out their goods, carts rumbling across stone streets, and crowds gathering in markets and forums. While some noise was unavoidable, Roman authorities sometimes introduced restrictions on activities that disrupted public order, especially during nighttime hours when citizens expected relative quiet. These early attempts to control noise reflected the idea that public spaces required balance between individual freedom and collective comfort. Today, modern cities still enforce noise regulations designed to protect residents from excessive disturbance, continuing a tradition that began during the Roman Empire. Roman law also shaped how societies deal with accidents and responsibility. In crowded urban environments, injuries could occur easily when construction materials fell from buildings or when animals and carts moved through narrow streets. Roman legal thinkers developed rules explaining when individuals were responsible for damage caused by their property or actions. For example, if something fell from a building and injured someone passing below, the property owner could be held responsible. These early legal ideas eventually evolved into modern liability law, which determines responsibility when accidents occur due to negligence or unsafe conditions. The Roman Empire even influenced the idea of regulated working hours. Because Roman cities depended heavily on daylight for most activities, markets, courts, and public services often operated according to specific schedules determined by the movement of the sun. Authorities established predictable hours for official business so that citizens could plan their daily activities around these schedules. Over time, the idea that work, trade, and government services operate within defined time structures became deeply embedded in organized societies. Modern office hours, business schedules, and administrative timetables reflect the same principle that daily life functions best when activities follow predictable rhythms. Another lasting Roman concept involves civic responsibility toward public property. Romans believed that buildings such as temples, baths, roads, and aqueducts belonged to the entire community rather than to individuals. Damaging or misusing these structures was treated as a serious offense because it threatened the welfare of the entire population. This belief that public infrastructure must be protected continues shaping modern law today. Vandalizing public buildings, damaging roads, or interfering with public utilities remains illegal in nearly every society, reflecting the same idea that some resources belong to everyone. Perhaps one of the most powerful Roman influences appears in the concept of citizenship duties. Roman citizens were expected not only to enjoy rights, but also to contribute to the stability of the state. Paying taxes, obeying laws, and participating in civic life were considered responsibilities that came with belonging to the Roman community. This idea gradually influenced later political systems across Europe and eventually contributed to modern democratic traditions where citizens hold both rights and obligations within the state. As centuries passed and the Roman Empire faded from political power, these everyday rules and habits quietly survived within the legal traditions of Europe. Medieval rulers studying Roman law recognized that many of its principles were practical solutions for managing large populations. Instead of abandoning these ideas, they preserved them within their own legal codes, allowing Roman influence to continue shaping society long after the empire itself disappeared. Even today, when people follow traffic rules, trust standardized measurements in markets, respect public infrastructure, or accept legal responsibility for accidents, they are unknowingly continuing patterns that began in ancient Roman cities nearly 2,000 years ago. The empire itself may have fallen, but many of the rules it created never truly disappeared. They simply became part of the everyday structure of the modern world. As Roman civilization matured and its cities grew larger and more complex, lawmakers realized that maintaining order required more than military discipline or written legal codes. A successful empire needed everyday habits that people would follow naturally, rules that quietly guided behavior without requiring constant enforcement. Over generations, these habits became deeply rooted in Roman culture, shaping how citizens interacted with each other, how businesses operated, and how public spaces were shared. Many of these patterns survived the collapse of the empire and gradually blended into the foundations of modern society. One of the most interesting Roman influences appears in the idea that buildings must follow safety standards. Ancient Roman cities were filled with tall apartment structures known as insulae, where large numbers of people lived in crowded conditions. Fires, collapsing walls, and unstable construction were constant dangers in these densely packed neighborhoods. In response, Roman authorities introduced regulations controlling how buildings could be constructed, how tall they could rise, and what materials could be used. These early building codes were designed to prevent disasters that could spread quickly through crowded streets. Modern building regulations, fire safety laws, and construction standards follow the same basic principle that cities must protect residents through controlled architectural design. Roman officials also introduced rules governing how land could be divided and inherited. Because property represented wealth and stability within Roman society, the empire developed detailed systems explaining how land passed from one generation to the next. Families used written wills to distribute property among heirs, ensuring that ownership remained clear even after a person's death. The idea that individuals can create legal wills to control how their property is distributed remains a central feature of modern law, reflecting traditions first refined by Roman jurists thousands of years ago. Another Roman habit that continues today involves the official recording of births and family relationships. In Roman society, family identity determined legal rights, citizenship status, and inheritance privileges. Authorities therefore maintained records of marriages and legitimate children so that legal claims could be verified when disputes occurred. Modern governments still maintain birth certificates, marriage registrations, and family records for exactly the same reason: to establish identity and protect legal rights connected to family relationships. Roman society also shaped the idea that public officials should operate within structured authority rather than personal power. Although Roman politics could be intense and competitive, many offices within the government had clearly defined duties and time limits. Magistrates, governors, and administrators were expected to follow established procedures rather than rule purely through personal command. This concept gradually influenced later political systems, eventually contributing to modern ideas about constitutional government and the limitation of authority through law. Even small daily habits sometimes reflect Roman influence. Consider the simple act of signing a document to confirm agreement or responsibility. Roman contracts often required witnesses and signatures or seals to ensure that agreements were recognized legally. These practices helped prevent disputes by providing clear evidence of consent. Today, signatures remain one of the most basic elements of legal documentation, used in everything from employment agreements to international treaties. Roman law also played a role in shaping the idea of compensation for harm. If someone caused damage to another person's property or livelihood, Roman courts could require the responsible party to provide financial compensation. This concept formed the foundation of modern civil law, where courts determine damages in cases involving negligence, property destruction, or economic loss. The idea that harm should be repaired through compensation rather than revenge reflects legal thinking that developed strongly during the Roman era. Another Roman rule that still influences society today involves the management of public gatherings. Roman cities frequently hosted large crowds during festivals, political assemblies, and entertainment events inside arenas and theaters. Managing these gatherings safely required organization and supervision. Officials controlled entry points, regulated movement through public spaces, and maintained order during events attended by thousands of people. Modern systems used to organize stadium crowds, concerts, and large public events follow the same principle that large groups must be carefully managed to prevent chaos or danger. Even the familiar idea that roads and bridges must remain open for public use reflects Roman thinking. Roman engineers built extensive transportation networks connecting cities across the empire, and laws protected these roads from obstruction or damage. Travelers, merchants, and military units depended on reliable routes to move efficiently across long distances. Today, governments maintain highways, railways, and transportation systems that remain accessible to the public, continuing the Roman belief that infrastructure must support mobility for the entire population. Roman influence also appears in the expectation that government authorities should provide certain public services. Roman leaders invested heavily in infrastructure such as aqueducts, baths, and grain distribution systems that supported the welfare of citizens living in large cities. Although these services were sometimes motivated by political strategy, they also established the idea that governments have responsibilities toward the communities they govern. Modern public services such as water supply systems, sanitation networks, and social welfare programs reflect similar thinking about the role of government in maintaining stability and well-being. What makes these Roman rules especially fascinating is how naturally they blend into modern life. Most people follow them every day without realizing that their origins stretch back more than 2,000 years. They feel ordinary because they have existed for so long that they appear almost timeless. Yet behind these everyday habits lies the legacy of a civilization that believed society should function through organized systems rather than chaos. The Romans built an empire not only through military conquest, but also through law, structure, and shared rules that allowed millions of people to live together under a common framework. As we continue exploring deeper into this hidden legacy of Rome, more examples will emerge, showing how the ancient empire quietly shaped the foundations of modern life. Long after the legions disappeared and the emperors faded into history, many of the rules created to manage Roman cities and citizens continued traveling through time, becoming invisible parts of the world we live in today. As Roman civilization reached its peak during the first centuries of the empire, its legal thinkers began refining the idea that a successful society must operate through predictable order rather than personal power. Roman jurists believed that rules should apply consistently so that citizens could understand how the system worked and trust that disputes would be resolved fairly. This philosophy became one of Rome's most powerful legacies, influencing not only legal systems but also the everyday expectations people hold about how society should function. One clear example of this influence appears in the modern idea that laws should apply equally to everyone. In earlier ancient societies, justice often depended on social rank or the personal authority of rulers. Roman law gradually moved toward a more structured system, where written rules determined outcomes rather than arbitrary decisions. While Roman society still contained strong social hierarchies, the development of legal codes helped establish the idea that the law itself should remain stable and recognizable. This concept eventually evolved into the modern principle often described as the rule of law, where governments and citizens alike are expected to operate within the same legal framework. Another Roman tradition that quietly survived into modern life involves the regulation of public contracts and state projects. When Roman authorities commissioned construction projects such as roads, aqueducts, or public buildings, they relied on agreements with contractors who promised to complete the work under specific conditions. These contracts outlined responsibilities, timelines, and payment arrangements to ensure that public resources were used efficiently. Today, governments continue using similar contract systems when hiring companies to build highways, bridges, and infrastructure projects, following administrative patterns first developed during Roman rule. Roman influence also appears in how societies manage disputes over debt and financial obligations. In ancient Rome, borrowing money was common for merchants, landowners, and traders who needed resources to expand their activities. Roman law developed detailed procedures explaining how debts could be recorded, repaid, and legally enforced. If a borrower failed to meet their obligations, courts could intervene to resolve the situation according to established rules. Modern banking systems, loan agreements, and financial regulations still operate on many of the same principles that Roman lawmakers established thousands of years ago. Even the idea that governments should regulate certain professions can be traced to Roman practice. In large Roman cities, occupations such as builders, merchants, physicians, and craftsmen often followed standards designed to maintain quality and protect public safety. Authorities sometimes supervise these professions to prevent fraud, unsafe construction, or harmful medical practices. Modern licensing systems that regulate professions like medicine, engineering, and law reflect the same belief that certain activities require standards to protect the public. Roman cities also introduced organized public services designed to support daily life. One famous example involved the distribution of grain to citizens in Rome itself. Because the city held such a massive population, ensuring a stable food supply became a priority for imperial authorities. Systems were created to transport grain from distant provinces and distribute it efficiently among residents. Although modern societies manage food supply through different economic systems, the idea that governments must sometimes intervene to prevent shortages reflects administrative thinking developed during the Roman era. Another surprisingly familiar Roman practice involves the management of public records and archives. Roman administrators carefully documented laws, financial transactions, military reports, and census data to maintain control over the vast empire. These records allowed officials to track taxation, population changes, and property ownership across enormous distances. Modern governments continue maintaining similar archives that store legal documents, population statistics, and administrative records essential for managing large societies. The Roman census itself became one of the empire's most important administrative tools. Authorities periodically counted the population and recorded details about households, property, and citizenship status. This information helped determine taxation levels and military responsibilities. Modern census systems used by governments around the world follow the same fundamental idea that understanding the population helps states organize resources and plan for future needs. Roman law also shaped how societies treat witnesses and testimony in legal disputes. When conflicts reached Roman courts, individuals could present statements describing what they had seen or experienced. Judges evaluated these testimonies alongside written evidence and legal principles before making decisions. The use of witnesses in modern court systems reflects the same belief that personal accounts can help establish the truth during legal proceedings. Perhaps one of the most enduring Roman contributions involves the belief that laws must evolve when societies change. Roman jurists frequently debated legal questions and adapted existing rules to address new situations. This flexibility allowed Roman law to remain useful, even as the empire expanded into new territories with different customs and traditions. Modern legal systems continue following this approach by interpreting older laws in ways that respond to changing circumstances. What makes this Roman legacy remarkable is how deeply it has blended into everyday life. Many people assume that the rules guiding modern society developed only in recent centuries. Yet many of these ideas were first organized by Roman lawmakers, attempting to manage the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. As time passed and the empire itself disappeared, these systems quietly survived through centuries of political transformation. Medieval scholars studied Roman legal texts, preserved in libraries and monasteries, rediscovering principles that could help organize societies emerging from chaos. Universities later taught Roman law as a foundation for legal education, spreading its influence across Europe and eventually across the world. Because of this long historical journey, countless rules that shape modern life today carry the hidden imprint of ancient Rome. From legal courts to contracts, from professional standards to public infrastructure, the structures designed to manage Roman society continue guiding the rhythms of the modern world, often without anyone realizing where these familiar rules first began. As Roman civilization continued refining its systems of law and administration, the empire gradually developed a powerful idea that would influence societies for centuries: the belief that order should exist not only in government, but also in everyday life. Roman thinkers believed that when rules shaped ordinary behavior, cities could function smoothly even when millions of people lived close together. This philosophy quietly shaped countless habits that later civilizations adopted without always remembering their Roman origins. One example appears in the idea that streets, roads, and public spaces belong to everyone, rather than to individual property owners. In Roman cities, roads were carefully planned and maintained because they allowed armies, merchants, and travelers to move efficiently across enormous distances. Roman law treated roads as public infrastructure that could not be blocked or claimed privately. People were expected to respect these shared pathways so that movement across the empire remained reliable. Today, the same principle continues through modern public road systems, where highways, bridges, and streets remain open for general use rather than controlled by private individuals. Another Roman rule that quietly shaped the modern world involves the organization of legal districts and local courts. Because the Roman Empire covered vast territory, central authorities could not resolve every dispute personally. Instead, regional officials were given the authority to oversee courts within specific areas. These officials applied Roman law while considering the local circumstances of the communities they governed. Modern judicial systems follow a similar pattern, where different courts operate at local, regional, and national levels, ensuring that legal disputes can be resolved efficiently without overwhelming a single authority. Roman legal thinkers also developed important ideas about guardianship and protection for individuals who could not manage their own affairs. Children, people suffering from illness, or individuals unable to handle financial matters could be placed under the protection of guardians who were responsible for making decisions in their best interest. This concept eventually evolved into modern legal systems that provide guardianship for minors or individuals requiring assistance with personal or financial decisions. Even the way societies organize official announcements has roots in Roman tradition. In ancient Rome, laws, decrees, and public decisions were often displayed in visible places, such as forums where citizens could read them. Public communication ensured that rules remained transparent and accessible to the population. Modern governments continue using similar methods when publishing laws, official notices, and public announcements, so that citizens remain informed about the rules affecting their lives. Roman influence can also be seen in the structure of official ceremonies and public authority. Roman leaders believed that certain rituals helped reinforce the legitimacy of government decisions. When magistrates assumed office or when laws were introduced, formal procedures demonstrated that authority came from established institutions rather than personal power. Modern political systems still rely on ceremonies such as inaugurations, parliamentary sessions, and judicial proceedings that emphasize continuity and legitimacy within government structures. Another lasting Roman idea involves the regulation of shared resources such as water. Roman engineers built aqueduct systems that carried water into cities from distant sources, supplying fountains, baths, and households. Because these systems served large populations, laws controlled how water could be distributed and protected from misuse. This early understanding that essential resources must be managed carefully continues influencing modern policies governing water systems energy supplies, and other shared utilities. Roman law also shaped how societies managed disputes involving neighbors and shared boundaries. In crowded Roman cities and agricultural regions, disagreements often arose over land borders, noise, construction, or access to shared paths. Roman jurists created rules explaining how such disputes could be resolved peacefully through legal processes rather than personal conflict. Modern property regulations, zoning laws, and neighborhood dispute systems reflect the same idea that conflicts between neighbors should be settled through structured legal solutions. Even the concept of legal appeals reflects Roman influence. If someone believed a court decision was incorrect or unfair, Roman law sometimes allowed the case to be reviewed by higher authorities. This system helped prevent mistakes and provided an additional layer of protection for individuals within the legal structure. Modern appeal courts operate on the same principle, allowing legal decisions to be reconsidered when new evidence or legal interpretation requires review. Roman society also emphasized the importance of written identity within administrative systems. Citizens were often registered in official records that documented family status, property ownership, and civic responsibilities. These records helped the empire track taxation, military service, and legal rights across its vast territories. Modern identification systems such as national records, identification documents, and legal registrations reflect similar administrative thinking developed during Roman rule. What makes these Roman contributions remarkable is how easily they blend into modern life. People follow these patterns every day without realizing that they were originally designed to solve problems in ancient cities nearly 2,000 years ago. The Roman Empire may have disappeared from political maps long ago, but the practical solutions its lawmakers developed proved so effective that later societies continued using them. Through centuries of change, through the medieval kingdoms, the rise of modern nations, and the development of global legal traditions, many Roman ideas remained quietly embedded within the foundations of modern civilization. The streets people walk on, the courts that resolve disputes, the rules governing property and responsibility, and the systems that organize public life all carry traces of Roman influence. In this way, ancient Rome never completely vanished. Its armies may have marched into history and its emperors may have faded into legend, but the everyday rules that once organized Roman society continue guiding the modern world in ways most people rarely notice. As Roman civilization continued expanding across 3 continents, the empire faced a challenge that few earlier societies had ever encountered. Millions of people from different cultures, languages, and traditions were now living under the same system of government. Managing such diversity required more than simple commands from emperors. The Romans needed rules that could operate consistently across distant provinces, rules that ordinary people could understand, even if they lived hundreds or thousands of kilometers away from the capital city. To solve this challenge, Roman administrators developed a system where law and social order relied on principles that were simple, practical, and widely applicable. These principles gradually shaped everyday life in ways that still feel familiar today. One of the most important Roman ideas involved the expectation that agreements between individuals must be honored once they are made. Roman society depended heavily on trade, contracts, and financial arrangements that connected merchants across the empire. For commerce to function, people needed confidence that agreements would be respected. Roman law therefore created clear expectations that promises made in legal agreements could not be ignored without consequences. This belief gradually evolved into modern contract law, where written agreements remain binding unless formally changed or canceled through legal procedures. Roman society also shaped the idea that property should be protected through law rather than personal force. In earlier periods of history, disputes over land or possessions could easily lead to violence. Roman jurists attempted to prevent this by creating legal frameworks that allowed property conflicts to be resolved peacefully in courts. The concept that property rights are protected by legal institutions rather than by personal defense remains one of the central pillars of modern legal systems. Another Roman rule that still influences daily life involves the expectation that public officials must document their decisions. Roman governors and magistrates were often required to record legal rulings, administrative orders, and financial transactions so that their actions could be reviewed later. This practice helped prevent corruption and ensured that government decisions remained transparent. Modern governments continue following the same principle through administrative records, official reports, and public documentation of legal decisions. Roman authorities also understood that large societies required standardized systems of measurement. Trade across the empire involved merchants transporting goods such as grain, oil, wine, and textiles between distant provinces. Without consistent measurements, disputes over quantities would constantly disrupt commerce. Roman officials therefore introduced standardized weights and measures that merchants were expected to follow. Modern systems of measurement used in commerce today reflect the same principle that trade must operate according to shared and predictable standards. Even the familiar structure of organized public services carries echoes of Roman administrative thinking. Roman cities employed workers responsible for maintaining roads, supervising markets, managing public buildings, and ensuring that urban life continued functioning smoothly. These early forms of municipal administration influenced later European cities, eventually shaping modern city governments that oversee infrastructure, sanitation, and public safety. Roman influence can also be seen in the idea that citizens have access to legal protection regardless of social position. While Roman society certainly contained inequalities, Roman law still attempted to establish procedures through which individuals could seek justice if they believed they had been treated unfairly. Courts existed to examine disputes, hear arguments, and issue rulings based on established legal principles. This early attempt to create structured legal access contributed to the development of modern justice systems, where individuals can challenge decisions through legal processes. Another important Roman rule involved the regulation of public marketplaces. Markets were essential centers of economic activity within Roman cities, where merchants sold goods arriving from across the empire. Authorities supervised these markets to ensure that trade remained fair and orderly. Fraudulent practices, dishonest measurements, or dangerous goods could lead to penalties because such behavior threatened the stability of the entire economic system. Today, governments continue regulating marketplaces, food safety, and consumer protection using principles similar to those first applied in Roman commercial law. Roman culture also reinforced the belief that written communication carried legal weight. Official letters, legal documents, and administrative orders were treated as authoritative sources of information. Written instructions from governors or magistrates could determine how laws were applied in distant regions of the empire. Modern bureaucratic systems still rely heavily on written documentation to ensure consistency and accountability in decision-making. Perhaps one of the most enduring Roman contributions involves the idea that society functions best when individuals understand the rules guiding their behavior. Roman lawmakers believed that clearly defined expectations helped prevent conflict by allowing citizens to anticipate how situations would be resolved. When people know the boundaries of acceptable conduct, they are less likely to fall into disputes that threaten social stability. This belief gradually became one of the foundations of modern civilization. Today, people follow countless rules every day: traffic regulations, legal procedures, commercial standards, and administrative processes, often without thinking about where these patterns originated. Yet many of these habits trace their intellectual roots back to Roman efforts to organize one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever known. As centuries passed, the empire itself slowly disappeared from political power, but its legal culture continued traveling through time. Scholars preserved Roman legal texts. Rulers adopted Roman principles for governing their own kingdoms, and universities later taught Roman law as the basis of legal education across Europe. Because of this long historical journey, many of the rules that shape modern society today are not entirely modern at all. They are echoes of solutions first developed by Roman lawmakers who were trying to bring order to a vast and complicated empire. Solutions that proved so effective that the world never truly stopped using them. As Roman civilization continued organizing its enormous empire, its leaders slowly realized something that would become one of Rome's greatest long-term achievements. Armies could conquer land, but only systems could hold an empire together. Cities needed reliable routines, citizens needed predictable expectations, and administrators needed rules that worked the same way in every province. Over time, these routines became so normal inside Roman society that people rarely stopped to question them. They simply followed them because they made life work smoothly. Many of those same routines eventually traveled through centuries of history and still shape modern life today. One example appears in the idea that legal disputes should follow a clear procedure, rather than emotional reaction. In Roman courts, cases did not begin with chaos or shouting arguments. Instead, the process followed specific stages. The complaint was first presented before a magistrate. The legal question was defined, and then the case moved forward to a judge who examined evidence and testimony. This structure ensured that disagreements were handled through a predictable process rather than through personal confrontation. Modern court systems still operate using very similar stages, where complaints are filed, hearings are scheduled, evidence is examined, and decisions are issued through organized procedures. Roman influence also appears in the expectation that official authority should be documented and recognizable. Roman administrators often carried written authority granted by the emperor or senate, confirming that they possessed legal power to make decisions in certain situations. This idea gradually evolved into the modern concept of official credentials. Today, police officers, government inspectors, and administrative officials carry identification or documentation showing that they have legal authority to perform specific duties. This system helps citizens recognize legitimate authority and prevents individuals from falsely claiming government power. Another Roman habit that still exists today involves public infrastructure designed for collective use. Roman engineers constructed bridges, roads, aqueducts, and harbors, not simply for private profit, but for the benefit of society as a whole. These projects were maintained through organized administration because they allowed trade, communication, and travel to function efficiently across vast distances. Modern infrastructure systems, such as highways, ports, and transportation networks, continue reflecting the Roman belief that certain structures must serve the entire community rather than individual interests. Roman legal thinking also shaped how societies handle responsibility for damage caused by negligence. If someone in Roman society created a dangerous situation that harmed others, such as poorly maintaining property or causing an accident, they could be required to compensate the injured party. This concept eventually evolved into modern negligence law, where individuals or organizations can be held responsible if their actions cause harm through carelessness. Insurance systems, civil lawsuits, and compensation claims all reflect legal ideas that Roman jurists began organizing nearly 2,000 years ago. Even the concept of public order during large gatherings reflects Roman influence. Roman cities frequently hosted massive events, such as games, festivals, and political assemblies that attracted thousands of people into confined spaces. Authorities had to manage entrances, seating arrangements, and crowd movement carefully to prevent disorder. Modern stadiums, concert halls, and public event spaces still follow similar principles when designing entrances, seating sections, and crowd control systems. Roman society also reinforced the idea that laws should remain visible and understandable. In early Roman history, citizens demanded that legal rules be written publicly so that officials could not manipulate them secretly. The famous 12 tables were displayed so that ordinary people could know the laws governing their lives. This tradition established the expectation that laws should not remain hidden, but should be accessible to the public. Modern governments continue publishing legal codes, regulations, and policies so that citizens can understand the rules that shape their society. Another Roman tradition that still affects everyday life involves the organization of taxation. The Roman Empire relied on structured tax systems to support its armies, infrastructure, and administrative networks. Taxes were calculated according to property, trade, or population records maintained through the Roman census. Modern taxation systems continue operating through similar principles, where governments collect revenue based on documented economic activity in order to fund public services and national institutions. Roman thinking also influenced the way societies treat official boundaries and jurisdictions. Because the empire stretched across huge distances, Roman administrators divided territories into provinces, districts, and cities, each with defined responsibilities and authority. This administrative structure helped maintain order by clarifying which officials were responsible for particular areas. Modern nations still organize governance through similar divisions such as states, provinces, counties, and municipalities. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this Roman legacy is how invisible it has become. People follow these systems every day without noticing their ancient origins. When someone signs a legal agreement, pays taxes, trusts public infrastructure, or relies on courts to resolve disputes, they are participating in systems that trace their intellectual ancestry back to the Roman world. The Roman Empire itself eventually faded from power, but the practical solutions its leaders created proved too useful to disappear. Instead, they survived through centuries of change, quietly shaping the foundations of medieval law, European governance, and eventually the global systems that organize modern civilization. In this way, the ancient world never completely vanished. Beneath the routines of modern life, the echoes of Roman rule still remain, guiding everyday behavior in ways that most people never stopped to notice. As the Roman Empire continued evolving during the height of its power, its leaders began recognizing something deeply important about human societies. Stability was not created only by powerful armies or wealthy rulers, but by predictable systems that ordinary people trusted. If citizens believed the rules around them were fair, consistent, and understandable, they would follow them naturally. Roman lawmakers therefore focused on creating systems that could operate reliably across the entire empire. Systems that continued functioning even when governors changed, when cities grew larger, or when new cultures became part of Roman territory. One powerful example of this Roman thinking can be seen in the modern idea that written law should remain consistent over time. Roman jurists spent generations carefully studying earlier laws and decisions in order to maintain stability. When new situations appeared, they tried to interpret older rules in ways that preserved continuity, instead of constantly replacing the legal system. This approach allowed Roman law to develop gradually while remaining recognizable to the population. Modern legal systems still follow this principle today, where earlier laws and court decisions influence how new cases are interpreted. Another Roman contribution that still affects modern life involves the concept of organized public administration. Roman cities required enormous amounts of coordination to function smoothly. Officials supervised markets, inspected public buildings, maintained roads, and ensured that water systems operated correctly. These responsibilities required trained administrators who could carry out duties according to clear procedures. The idea that governments should employ professional administrators to manage public services became a lasting feature of modern states. Today, city governments, public departments, and civil service systems continue performing roles that resemble the administrative structures first developed in Roman municipalities. Roman influence also appears in the expectation that contracts and legal agreements must contain clear terms that both parties understand before accepting them. Roman merchants and property owners frequently relied on written agreements describing obligations, payments, and responsibilities. This practice reduced confusion and helped courts resolve disputes by examining the original agreement. Modern contracts follow the same principle by defining responsibilities in detail so that disagreements can later be resolved through legal interpretation rather than guesswork. Even the familiar idea of public accountability carries strong Roman influence. Roman officials were expected to justify their decisions and could sometimes face investigation if their actions appeared corrupt or harmful to the state. While Roman politics often remained intense and competitive, the expectation that authority should be examined and recorded gradually shaped later political traditions. Modern systems of government accountability, including audits, investigations, and public oversight, reflect this long historical development. Roman society also shaped how people think about shared civic identity. Citizens of the empire were connected not only by territory but by a system of rights and responsibilities defined through law. Being a Roman citizen carried legal protections, but it also required obedience to the laws of the state. This concept eventually influenced the modern idea that citizenship includes both privileges and duties within a political community. Another Roman habit that still exists today involves the careful planning of transportation networks. Roman engineers built roads that connected distant provinces to major cities, allowing trade, communication, and military movement across the empire. These roads were constructed with durability in mind, using layered materials and precise engineering that allowed many of them to survive for centuries. In some parts of Europe, modern roads still follow routes originally established during Roman times. The idea that transportation infrastructure should connect regions through organized networks remains a central part of modern economic planning. Roman law also contributed to the idea that disputes between individuals should be resolved through neutral authorities rather than through personal retaliation. Earlier societies sometimes relied on revenge or personal confrontation when conflicts occurred. Roman legal systems attempted to replace these patterns with structured courts where disputes could be evaluated according to established rules. This approach reduced violence and helped maintain social stability across the empire. Modern legal systems still operate on the same basic principle that justice should be administered through impartial institutions. The Roman Empire also introduced administrative practices that influenced how governments collect and manage information. Roman census records documented populations, property, and taxation responsibilities across enormous territories. These records helped officials understand the resources available to the state and plan administrative decisions accordingly. Modern governments continue using census systems and statistical data to guide policy decisions, reflecting administrative methods first developed during Roman rule. As the centuries passed after the fall of Rome, these legal and administrative traditions did not disappear. Scholars preserved Roman legal texts, rulers adopted Roman principles when building new governments, and universities later studied Roman law as a model of organized legal thinking. Because these ideas proved practical and effective, they gradually became embedded within the foundations of modern civilization. Today, countless aspects of daily life still follow patterns that Roman lawmakers introduced long ago. Courts rely on structured procedures, governments maintain administrative records, contracts define agreements between individuals, and citizens participate in systems of law designed to maintain order across large societies. These practices feel natural because they have existed for so long that people rarely question their origins. Yet behind these everyday systems lies the legacy of ancient Rome, a civilization that believed society could be guided not only by power, but by organized rules that applied across an entire empire. Even though the empire itself vanished more than 15 centuries ago, many of the rules it created quietly continued shaping the world that followed, becoming permanent parts of the structures that still organize modern life today. As Roman civilization continued refining its systems of governance, one of its greatest achievements was the creation of everyday order inside enormous cities. Rome itself at its peak contained more than 1 million people, making it one of the largest cities the ancient world had ever seen. Managing such a massive population required careful planning and countless small rules that kept daily life functioning smoothly. These rules were not always dramatic or famous like Roman wars or emperors, yet they quietly shaped how people behaved in public spaces, how businesses operated, and how communities maintained stability. Many of these practical rules slowly traveled through centuries of history and still shape the structure of modern societies today. One example of this Roman influence appears in the idea that governments must regulate construction within cities to prevent overcrowding and danger. In ancient Rome, large apartment buildings known as insulae housed thousands of residents in dense neighborhoods. Because fires and structural collapses were constant threats, Roman authorities eventually created regulations controlling how tall buildings could be constructed and how materials were used. These early building regulations represented one of the first organized attempts to manage urban safety through law, rather than through individual responsibility alone. Modern building codes that regulate construction safety, fire protection, and structural design follow the same fundamental principle introduced in Roman cities. Roman society also shaped the expectation that public officials must maintain infrastructure rather than allowing it to deteriorate. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, and drainage systems required constant maintenance to remain functional. Roman administrators organized teams responsible for inspecting these systems and repairing damage before it became dangerous. This concept of preventive maintenance continues influencing modern governments today. Cities around the world maintain departments responsible for inspecting roads, repairing bridges, maintaining water systems, and ensuring that infrastructure remains safe for public use. Another Roman habit that still exists in modern life involves the registration of property ownership. Roman legal systems required property transactions to be documented so that ownership remained clear even after years passed. Written records protected both buyers and sellers by establishing official proof of ownership. Today, property registries and land records operate according to the same principle. Governments maintain documentation showing who owns specific land or buildings, so that disputes can be resolved through recorded evidence. Roman influence also appears in the expectation that disputes between citizens should be resolved through mediation or formal legal procedures rather than personal conflict. In Roman courts, judges attempted to examine evidence carefully and reach decisions that balanced fairness with legal precedent. This approach helped prevent conflicts from escalating into violence, especially in crowded cities where tensions could easily spread. Modern legal systems still emphasize structured dispute resolution through courts, mediation, and arbitration, rather than allowing individuals to settle disagreements through confrontation. Even the idea that governments must maintain public order through organized law enforcement reflects Roman practice. Roman cities employed officials responsible for maintaining security, investigating crimes, and ensuring that laws were followed within urban areas. These early policing roles gradually influenced later institutions responsible for maintaining public safety. Modern police forces and municipal security systems carry out responsibilities that resemble those performed by Roman officials centuries ago. Roman thinking also shaped how societies organized taxation systems. Because the empire required resources to maintain armies, infrastructure, and administration, Roman authorities developed structured methods for collecting taxes from citizens and provinces. These systems relied on documented property, population counts, and trade activity to determine contributions to the state. Modern taxation systems continue operating on the same general principle that governments require organized revenue systems to support public services and national institutions. Another lasting Roman idea involves the expectation that governments should maintain official archives, preserving records of laws and decisions. Roman administrators carefully documented legal rulings, government decrees, and financial transactions so that information remained accessible for future reference. Modern archives, government record offices, and legal databases reflect the same belief that societies must preserve official documentation to maintain transparency and continuity. Roman society also contributed to the idea that cities should be designed with public spaces, where citizens could gather, conduct business, and exchange information. Forums, marketplaces, and public squares served as central locations where legal announcements were made and community activities occurred. These spaces allowed information to spread quickly among the population and reinforced civic identity within Roman society. Modern cities still maintain public squares, civic centers, and marketplaces that serve similar roles as gathering places within urban environments. Perhaps one of the most powerful Roman contributions to modern civilization involves the belief that stable societies require systems stronger than individual leaders. Roman law attempted to create structures that would continue functioning regardless of which emperor or official held power at a given moment. This concept gradually influenced later political systems that sought to build governments based on institutions rather than personalities. Modern democratic systems, legal frameworks, and administrative structures reflect the same long-term goal of creating stability through institutions that outlast individual rulers. When we step back and observe modern life carefully, the hidden presence of Roman influence becomes surprisingly clear. The rules governing buildings, roads, contracts, property ownership, courts, taxation, and public administration all carry traces of ideas developed during the Roman Empire. These ideas survived not because people deliberately tried to preserve Roman culture, but because the solutions Roman lawmakers created proved effective for organizing complex societies. Over centuries, these rules quietly blended into the foundations of modern civilization, becoming so familiar that most people never question where they originated. Yet behind the systems that guide everyday life today lies the distant legacy of a civilization that believed order, stability, and cooperation could be achieved through carefully designed rules shared by an entire society. As Roman civilization matured during the later centuries of the empire, its lawmakers and administrators gradually created a system of rules that extended far beyond simple legal control. What made Roman society unique was its belief that order should exist everywhere, not only in courts or government offices, but also in markets, neighborhoods, public spaces, and everyday interactions between citizens. Rome attempted to design a society where people understood the expectations placed upon them, where rules created predictable behavior that allowed millions of individuals to live together without constant conflict. Many of these expectations quietly survived the collapse of the empire and still shape modern life today. One important Roman influence appears in the idea that governments should maintain standardized systems for commerce and trade. Roman markets connected distant provinces of the empire, allowing goods such as olive oil, grain, wine, textiles, and metals to move across thousands of kilometers. To make this trade possible, authorities ensured that weights and measurements remained consistent across the empire. Merchants in Spain, Egypt, and Italy could trust that the units used to measure goods followed recognized standards. This prevented confusion and protected buyers from fraud. Modern trade systems continue using standardized measurements for exactly the same reason, ensuring that products sold in markets follow clear and reliable quantities. Roman law also helped shape the idea that written agreements provide legal protection. When merchants or landowners entered contracts, Roman law encouraged the use of written documentation that described the responsibilities of each party. These documents could later be examined in court if disagreements occurred. Today, this habit is so common that people rarely question it. From employment agreements to rental contracts and financial transactions, Written documentation remains one of the most important tools used to prevent disputes and maintain trust in modern economies. Another Roman practice that still exists today involves the careful organization of urban neighborhoods. Roman cities were often divided into districts that helped authorities manage large populations more effectively. Each district contained residential areas, markets, workshops, and public spaces arranged in ways that allowed daily life to function efficiently. This early form of urban planning eventually influenced later European cities and modern metropolitan development. Today, cities continue organizing neighborhoods into districts with specific zoning patterns that control residential, commercial, and public activities. Roman influence can also be seen in how societies treat evidence during legal disputes. Roman jurists believed that decisions should not rely only on accusations, but on careful examination of available evidence. Witness testimony, written agreements, and physical proof could all be considered when judges evaluated a case. This approach gradually shaped the modern legal principle that justice should depend on evidence rather than rumor or assumption. Modern court systems still operate according to the same idea that claims must be supported by proof before legal decisions are made. Even the idea that governments must maintain communication networks reflects Roman thinking. The Roman Empire operated an extensive courier system that allowed messages to travel rapidly between distant provinces and the capital. Roads built for military and administrative purposes also carried information across the empire. This early communication network allowed officials to coordinate decisions across enormous distances. Modern communication infrastructure, from postal systems to digital networks, continues following the same basic principle that large societies require reliable channels for transmitting information. Roman society also shaped the expectation that laws should remain stable over time. Although new situations required adjustments, Roman lawmakers tried to avoid constantly changing rules in ways that would confuse citizens. Stability allowed individuals and businesses to plan their activities with confidence. Modern legal systems still recognize this importance, often preserving established laws while gradually modifying them when necessary. Another lasting Roman tradition involves the idea that communities require public institutions where citizens can interact with government authority. Roman forums served as centers where legal announcements were made, disputes were discussed, and public decisions were communicated. These spaces allowed citizens to remain connected to the political life of the empire. Modern civic buildings such as courthouses, city halls, and administrative centers continue serving similar functions as locations where citizens engage with the institutions that govern their society. Roman law also contributed to the belief that punishment should be defined by legal systems rather than personal revenge. Earlier societies sometimes allowed individuals or families to settle disputes through retaliation. Roman legal systems attempted to replace these patterns with structured punishments determined by courts. This approach helped maintain social stability and reduced cycles of violence. Modern justice systems still operate according to the same principle that crimes should be addressed through legal processes rather than personal retaliation. As the centuries passed after the fall of Rome, these legal habits and administrative structures did not vanish. Scholars preserved Roman legal texts in monasteries and universities, studying them as examples of organized legal reasoning. European kingdoms later adopted many Roman principles when developing their own laws, gradually blending Roman traditions into the foundations of modern governance. Because of this long historical process, countless rules that shape everyday life today still reflect Roman ideas about order, responsibility, and civic cooperation. Whether people are signing contracts, following standardized measurements, presenting evidence in court, or interacting with government institutions, they are participating in systems that carry the distant imprint of ancient Rome. Even though the empire itself disappeared more than 15 centuries ago, the practical solutions its lawmakers developed proved so effective that they continued guiding human societies long after the legions stopped marching and the emperors faded into history. As Roman society continued expanding across Europe, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East, its system of rules gradually moved beyond simple governance and began shaping the daily rhythm of life for millions of people living under Roman authority. The Romans believed that a stable civilization depended not only on strong armies or powerful emperors, but on small, consistent rules that organized ordinary life. These rules touched nearly every part of society, from how people traveled to how businesses operated and how public behavior was expected to function inside crowded cities. Over time, many of these rules quietly survived the fall of the empire and became part of the invisible structure supporting modern civilization. One of the most enduring Roman ideas involved the expectation that public roads should remain open and accessible for everyone. The Romans invested enormous resources into building an advanced road network stretching across the empire, connecting distant provinces with the capital and allowing goods, soldiers, and information to move quickly. But building roads was only part of the system. Roman law established rules ensuring that roads remained usable and protected from obstruction. Private individuals could not block important routes or claim sections of major roads for personal control. This idea, that infrastructure belongs to the public and must remain accessible, still influences modern transportation systems. Highways, bridges, and public roads today follow the same principle first organized during the Roman era. Another Roman practice that continues influencing modern life involves the regulation of marketplaces. Roman markets were busy centers where farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and traders gathered to exchange goods. Because these markets served thousands of people each day, authorities developed rules designed to maintain fairness and prevent exploitation. Vendors were expected to sell products honestly without manipulating measurements or misrepresenting quality. Market inspectors monitored activity to ensure that these standards were followed. Today, consumer protection laws reflect the same Roman belief that markets must operate fairly so that buyers and sellers can trust the system. Roman society also contributed to the idea that governments should maintain public sanitation systems to protect community health. Large Roman cities required organized waste removal and drainage to prevent disease from spreading through densely populated neighborhoods. Aqueducts delivered clean water, while drainage systems carried waste away from living areas. Although modern sanitation technology has advanced significantly, the basic concept remains the same. Cities must maintain systems that protect public health through clean water and waste management. This idea, which seems obvious today, was one of the practical innovations that allowed Roman cities to support enormous populations. Another Roman rule that quietly shaped the future involved the expectation that travelers should be able to find shelter and services along major routes. Roman roads were supported by networks of inns, supply stations, and rest points that allowed officials, merchants, and travelers to continue long journeys safely. These facilities provided food, rest and fresh horses for messengers traveling across the empire. Modern transportation systems follow a similar pattern, with service stations, hotels, and rest areas supporting travelers along highways and major routes. Roman thinking also helped develop the idea that public behavior should follow certain standards in shared spaces. In crowded cities like Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, thousands of people moved through streets, markets, and bathhouses each day. Social expectations encouraged citizens to behave respectfully in these shared environments to prevent conflict. Although enforcement varied, the underlying principle remained clear. Public spaces function best when individuals follow shared rules of behavior. Modern cities still rely on these unwritten social expectations to maintain order within large populations. The Roman approach to education also influenced later societies in subtle ways. Roman schools emphasized rhetoric, logic, and structured argument, teaching students how to express ideas clearly and persuasively. These educational traditions later shaped the development of universities across Europe, influencing how academic knowledge was organized and transmitted. Even today, many educational methods reflect the Roman emphasis on structured thinking and disciplined learning. Roman administrative systems also introduced the idea that governments should maintain detailed population records. Census operations recorded information about citizens, property ownership, and economic activity throughout the empire. These records helped authorities manage taxation, military service, and infrastructure planning. Modern governments still conduct population censuses for similar reasons, gathering data that allows policymakers to understand demographic patterns and allocate resources effectively. Another lasting Roman influence appears in the expectation that cities should maintain organized emergency responses to disasters such as fires. In Rome, large fires posed constant danger due to crowded wooden buildings. To address this threat, Roman authorities organized firefighting groups responsible for controlling blazes and protecting neighborhoods from destruction. Although technology has changed dramatically, modern fire departments continue fulfilling the same role first institutionalized in Roman cities. As centuries passed after the fall of the empire, these practical systems did not disappear. Instead, they were gradually absorbed into the evolving legal traditions of Europe and the Mediterranean world. Medieval kingdoms inherited many Roman administrative ideas, adapting them to local conditions while preserving their underlying logic. Over time, these systems spread across continents, shaping the structure of modern governments and societies. When we examine everyday life today, many familiar practices reveal deep historical roots reaching back to Roman civilization. Rules governing roads, marketplaces, sanitation, public behavior, education, census records, and emergency services all reflect ideas first developed during the long centuries when Rome attempted to manage one of the largest and most complex societies the ancient world had ever seen. The remarkable legacy of Rome lies not only in its monuments or military achievements, but in these quiet rules that still guide the rhythm of modern life. Systems designed to keep order in ancient cities have continued shaping how societies organize themselves long after the empire itself disappeared into history. As Roman civilization reached the height of its power, the empire developed systems that quietly shaped everyday behavior in ways people rarely noticed. These were not dramatic laws carved on stone monuments or shouted in public forums. Instead, they were practical habits, administrative rules, and social expectations that helped millions of people live together across an enormous empire stretching from Britain to the deserts of Syria. These rules organized daily life so effectively that many of them survived the collapse of Rome and slowly blended into the foundations of modern society. One such Roman principle involved the idea that government authority must regulate public safety in crowded urban environments. Cities like Rome, Pompeii, and Ostia contained dense neighborhoods where narrow streets, markets, and apartment buildings created constant risks. To reduce accidents and chaos, Roman officials began creating rules controlling how vehicles and carts moved through certain streets. In some areas, heavy wagons were restricted during the busiest hours of the day to prevent congestion and danger for pedestrians. This early attempt to control urban traffic eventually influenced modern traffic regulations that organize how vehicles move safely through crowded cities. Roman society also shaped the expectation that communities should maintain systems for public announcements and information sharing. In Roman cities, important messages were often posted on public boards or announced in marketplaces so that citizens could remain informed about new laws, legal decisions, and government activities. These announcements helped create transparency between authorities and the public. Today, governments still rely on public notices, official bulletins, and media channels to communicate important information to citizens. Another Roman rule that echoes through modern life involves the idea that professional trades should follow recognized standards. Roman craftsmen, such as builders, metalworkers, bakers, and textile producers, often worked within organized associations that maintained expectations about quality and skill. These associations helped ensure that customers could trust the work being performed. Over centuries, this concept evolved into modern professional standards, trade certifications, and licensing systems that regulate occupations ranging from construction to medicine. Roman law also contributed to the principle that individuals accused of wrongdoing should have an opportunity to defend themselves before punishment is applied. Roman courts allowed defendants to present arguments, witnesses, and evidence in their defense. This practice helped shape later legal traditions that emphasize fairness during trials and protect individuals from arbitrary punishment. Modern legal systems around the world continue following this fundamental idea that justice requires careful evaluation of both accusation and defense. Another lasting Roman influence appears in the expectation that public funds must be used to maintain services benefiting the community. Roman authorities collected taxes to support roads, aqueducts, public baths, grain distribution systems, and security forces. Citizens understood that these services existed because the government managed shared resources for the benefit of society. Modern public services, from transportation networks to healthcare systems, continue operating under the same principle that taxes fund services supporting the well-being of the population. The Romans also shaped the idea that cities should include spaces dedicated to leisure and social gathering. Amphitheaters, bathhouses, gardens, and forums served as places where citizens could relax, socialize, and participate in communal activities. These spaces strengthened social bonds and provided relief from the pressures of daily work. Modern cities still follow this concept by maintaining parks, recreational areas, sports venues, and community centers designed to support public well-being. Roman society also emphasized the importance of written records for preserving historical memory and administrative continuity. Government officials carefully documented laws, property transactions, census information, and legal decisions. These records allowed future officials to understand past actions and maintain consistency in governance. Modern bureaucratic systems continue relying on extensive documentation to ensure that decisions remain transparent and traceable over time. Another Roman contribution involves the expectation that military service and civic duty were connected to citizenship. Roman citizens understood that protecting the state and contributing to public responsibilities were part of belonging to the community. While modern societies express this idea in different ways, the connection between citizenship and civic responsibility remains deeply rooted in the traditions shaped by Roman political culture. Even everyday etiquette inside public institutions reflects Roman influence. When citizens entered Roman courts, administrative buildings, or official gatherings, they followed certain behaviors demonstrating respect for authority and social order. These expectations helped maintain discipline and efficiency during important proceedings. Today, similar expectations exist in courtrooms, government offices, and formal institutions where structured behavior supports orderly interaction. As centuries passed and the Roman Empire gradually faded, these systems did not disappear entirely. Instead, they survived through legal texts, cultural traditions, and administrative practices that later societies adopted and modified. Medieval scholars studied Roman law, while emerging European kingdoms borrowed Roman administrative ideas when building their own governments. Through this long historical process, many Roman rules quietly became part of the structure supporting modern civilization. Traffic regulations, professional standards, public announcements, fair trials, civic responsibility, and public infrastructure all reflect principles that were once developed to manage the complex world of ancient Rome. When people move through modern cities today, following rules that organize transportation, commerce, law, and public services, they are participating in systems whose distant origins reach back to a civilization that existed more than 2,000 years ago. The empire itself may have vanished, but the quiet logic behind its rules continues guiding the rhythm of everyday life. As Roman civilization continued refining its systems of law and administration, another important group of rules slowly emerged, rules that shaped how people behaved in everyday social situations. These were not dramatic political laws or military orders. Instead, they were expectations about courtesy, responsibility, and order that allowed a huge population to function peacefully inside busy cities and provinces scattered across the empire. Over time, these habits became so deeply embedded in Roman culture that later societies inherited them almost without realizing it. One of the most influential Roman traditions involved the idea that citizens should respect lines of authority in organized institutions. Roman administrative offices operated through clear hierarchies. Officials had defined responsibilities, and citizens were expected to follow procedures when presenting requests or complaints. This structure prevented confusion and chaos when thousands of people interacted with government offices each day. Modern bureaucratic systems, from city councils to national agencies, still operate through similar chains of authority designed to keep institutions functioning efficiently. Roman culture also encouraged the idea that individuals should respect queues and orderly waiting in crowded environments. In large Roman cities, bathhouses, marketplaces, courts, and grain distribution centers often served enormous numbers of people each day. To prevent disorder, citizens gradually adopted habits of waiting their turn, and following organized sequences when receiving services. This social expectation, though rarely written as law, became an important part of maintaining public harmony. Today, the simple act of standing in line for services continues reflecting this ancient idea that order helps prevent conflict in shared spaces. Another Roman rule that influenced later societies involved the expectation that businesses should operate during predictable hours. Roman marketplaces and workshops typically followed regular schedules so that citizens could depend on services being available at certain times. This predictability allowed economic activity to function smoothly across the city. Modern business hours, store schedules, and service availability still follow the same principle of predictable timing that first developed in organized Roman markets. Roman thinking also shaped the belief that governments should protect public trust by punishing corruption among officials. Because the empire relied on administrators managing taxes, construction projects, and legal decisions, Roman law attempted to discourage officials from abusing their power for personal gain. While corruption certainly existed, the legal framework recognized that trust in government depended on accountability. Modern anti-corruption laws and transparency systems continue reflecting this Roman belief that public authority must be exercised responsibly. Another Roman idea that still influences modern society is the expectation that communities should support systems of charity and assistance for vulnerable populations. Wealthy Romans often funded public works, food distribution programs, or financial assistance for poorer citizens as part of civic duty. These acts were sometimes motivated by social prestige, but they also reinforced the belief that stable societies required some form of support for those facing hardship. Today, public welfare systems, charitable foundations, and community aid programs reflect similar values. Roman influence can also be seen in the way societies organize calendars and public holidays. Roman administrators carefully structured the calendar to coordinate legal activities, religious observances, and civic events throughout the year. Citizens relied on these shared schedules to plan business, travel, and celebrations. Modern calendars still reflect this idea that societies benefit from shared systems, organizing time, work, and public holidays. Even architectural habits carry traces of Roman thinking. Roman cities often arranged streets in structured grids that allowed efficient movement and clear navigation. This pattern helped travelers and merchants find locations more easily while supporting organized development of neighborhoods. Many modern cities around the world still use grid patterns influenced by Roman urban planning techniques. Another subtle Roman legacy appears in the idea that written law should remain accessible so that citizens understand the rules governing their lives. Roman leaders recognized that laws hidden from the public could easily be manipulated by powerful individuals. By publishing legal codes and allowing citizens to consult them, Roman authorities attempted to create a system where rules were visible and predictable. Modern legal systems continue emphasizing transparency by publishing laws, regulations, and legal decisions for public access. Roman society also helped shape the idea that large communities require shared civic identity to function effectively. Citizens across distant provinces often identified themselves as part of the Roman world, connected through language, law, infrastructure, and cultural traditions. This shared identity helped maintain stability across an empire containing many different ethnic groups and regions. Modern nations still rely on similar ideas of shared identity to unite populations living across large territories. As centuries passed and the Roman Empire eventually declined, these habits of organization did not disappear. Instead, they spread gradually into the societies that emerged after Rome's fall. Medieval kingdoms, Renaissance city-states, and modern governments all borrowed elements of Roman administration and civic life, adapting them to new historical conditions while preserving their practical value. When we examine everyday systems today, queues in public places, predictable business hours, transparent laws, structured bureaucracies, organized calendars, and civic responsibilities, we can still see echoes of the Roman world shaping how societies function. These quiet rules may no longer carry Roman names, yet they remain living reminders of a civilization that devoted enormous effort to designing systems capable of managing complex human communities. As the Roman world moved through its later centuries, many of the systems it had created were no longer simply tools of empire, but foundations of everyday life. Roads stretched across continents. Courts handled disputes according to written laws. Cities operated through organized administrations, and millions of people lived under shared expectations about order, responsibility, and cooperation. What makes Rome remarkable is not only that it built an empire, but that it designed systems that continued functioning long after emperors disappeared and armies stopped marching. One of the most powerful Roman ideas that survived into modern civilization was the belief that law should apply to everyone within a society, not only to the powerful. Roman legal thinkers spent generations developing the concept that citizens shared a framework of rights and responsibilities defined by law. While Roman society was far from perfectly equal, the idea that law could serve as a structured system governing relationships between individuals gradually shaped later legal traditions. Over centuries, this principle evolved into modern ideas about legal equality and the rule of law. Roman administration also helped establish the expectation that large societies require organized documentation to remain stable. Taxes, property ownership, military service, trade agreements, and legal disputes all depended on written records. Without these documents, confusion and conflict would quickly spread. This habit of careful record-keeping later became one of the pillars of medieval governance and eventually modern bureaucratic states. Today, governments maintain enormous archives of records for exactly the same reason that Roman administrators once documented the affairs of the empire. Another lasting Roman legacy lies in the idea that infrastructure forms the backbone of civilization. Aqueducts carried water across valleys, roads connected distant cities, ports supported international trade, and bridges allowed travel across powerful rivers. Roman leaders understood that strong infrastructure created stability, economic growth, and political unity. Modern societies still follow this same philosophy when building highways, railways, water systems, and communication networks that connect people across vast territories. Roman influence also shaped the concept that education plays an essential role in preserving civilization. Roman teachers emphasized rhetoric, philosophy, law, and history as tools for preparing citizens to participate in public life. These educational traditions survived through medieval monasteries and later universities, gradually influencing how knowledge was organized and transmitted across generations. Modern educational institutions still reflect many of the intellectual traditions that developed during Roman times. Even cultural habits reveal Roman influence in subtle ways. The expectation that societies celebrate public holidays, maintain civic ceremonies, and commemorate historical events reflects Roman traditions of public festivals and shared rituals. These activities helped strengthen social unity by reminding citizens that they belong to a larger community with shared history and values. Over time, as the Western Roman Empire declined during the 5th century, many of its institutions slowly weakened. Roads deteriorated, cities shrank, and political authority fragmented into smaller kingdoms. Yet the ideas behind Roman systems never fully vanished. Scholars preserved Roman legal texts, rulers studied Roman administration, and communities continued using many of the practices that had once organized imperial life. During the medieval period, European kingdoms rediscovered Roman law and began integrating its principles into emerging legal systems. Centuries later, Renaissance thinkers admired Roman governance as a model of structured civilization. Eventually, modern states inherited countless elements of Roman organization: legal codes, administrative structures, infrastructure planning, and civic responsibilities. This quiet survival of Roman ideas explains why the influence of the empire still surrounds us today. When people drive on organized road networks, sign legal contracts, follow public laws, participate in civic duties, or rely on government institutions, they are interacting with systems whose roots extend back to Roman civilization. The empire itself disappeared long ago, but the logic behind its rules proved remarkably durable. Rome believed that order could be built through laws, infrastructure, shared responsibilities, and careful administration. These ideas traveled through centuries of history, adapting to new cultures and technologies while preserving their essential purpose, helping large human societies function with stability and cooperation. And so when we look at the modern world with its courts, governments, cities, and systems guiding everyday life, we are still seeing echoes of ancient Rome quietly shaping how civilization operates. If you enjoyed drifting slowly through this deep journey into the forgotten rules of the Roman world, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share which ancient civilization you would like to explore next in another long, calm dive into history.